I was at a research seminar a few nights ago at work, and one of my colleagues there was speaking about the underworld. Well, the context of the presentation actually was about the kind of illegal distribution of toxic waste, particularly amongst certain groups of organised crime groups in southern Italy. That was the kind of context of it. But one of the things that was, one of the ideas that was explored throughout this was the idea of the underworld. Obviously, in that particular case, the clear reference was to do with the criminal underworld. But the idea of underworlds more generally, there was a lot of interesting things to say about that particular presentation, and a lot of really disturbing facts presented as a result of that. But one of the things that struck me was this thing that came out of a particular quotation from a James Hillman book, I think, which was called something like Dreams and the Underworld. I didn't really get the reference, I'll have to find out. And this, I don't know James Hillman's writing terribly well. I've read one of his books called Soul's Code, something like that. But as I understand it, this book, Dreams and the Underworld, is a kind of analysis of the idea of underworlds as it plays out in psychoanalysis and other kinds of discourse, really, I suppose. But there's one particular paragraph that David read out was to do with the idea of underness and what underness represents. And it incorporated a kind of list. I'll have to get the full reference because it was a great list. But it was to do with things like the lower parts of the body, the areas under the ground, the underside of stones, the underside of anything that can be lifted and turned over, and a range of other experiences that we associate with downness and underness. And one of the things that struck me about that list, well, several things actually. One was the kind of relationship to that, some of the other things I've been talking about, in terms of the kind of vertical dimension in kind of our phenomenological experience of the world. And what I've spoken of in the past is to do with various consistencies and correlations that exist in our completely lived experience to do with the vertical dimension. Like I've spoken, for example, about upness, highly correlating with increasing lightness, illumination, simply because, as we raise our eyes from the ground to the sky, 9 times out of 10 what we'll experience is increasing illumination. So I think there's this correlation between the vertical dimension and light being up and dark being down, but various others as well, to do with upness, as I've said, being to kind of correlating experientially with increasing coherence and convergence, most famously in that quotation from Teilhard de Chardin, where he says something like all that rises converges, and how that has a kind of phenomenological experiential base in lived experience as we look up, as I'm looking up right now, to various tall objects that I'm surrounded by. I'm not surrounded by a great number of tall objects right now, but to the extent I am, they all point to the same singular azimuth point at the top of just above my head, I suppose, really. So there's a sense in which all of the lines of the world around me point to a convergent point above my head. So if I was standing in a forest clearing and I looked up, I would seem to see the trees all pointing to the centre. So again, I think there's a kind of correlation there between upness and convergence. And what I've also suggested in that is there's a kind of complementary and opposite correspondence between downness and apartness. I think it's more complex and more multivalent, that particular one, but certainly downness seems to often indicate disintegration. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold, mere chaos is loosed upon the world, as Yeats puts it. But this idea of the underworld, just to return to James Hillman's quotation, it's the idea of downness and underness in that sense. I mean, one of the things that, within that analysis that I understand Hillman to give, some of those correlations are clearly associated with the ones that I've also identified in terms of upness and downness. That the downness associates with darkness, and darkness is inherently absence of light, absence of visibility, a muting of the visual sense, and all the things that go with that. A difference in the kind of knowledge one can access. Downness and underness, deprived of the dark. Objectivity kind of disappears, because objectivity, in the terms that I've been speaking about it at least, is dependent upon a metaphor of visible objects standing in interpersonal space. Under the ground there is no interpersonal space, there is no light for objects to become visible within. So other kinds of knowing must take place, or the metaphors of knowing must take place. So again, there's a sense of the darkness of the down and the darkness of the underground and the underworld is not only a place of fragmentation, but it's a place of a different kind of sensory engagement, if sensory engagement at all. And of course it has all those other associations, I think, with obviously death, but also with a kind of giving in. Because there's a sense, I think, in which just standing upright and being awake is a constant resistance to the pull of gravity, as we know. We don't think of it in those terms, I guess, at least I don't usually. But there is a sense, I think, in which just to be alive and awake is to constantly be in a position of not falling over, not giving in to gravity. There's a kind of resistance present at all times in that. And downness, movement in a downward direction, I think always has this sense of giving in. Well, it's interesting we say giving in to gravity, but taking that resistance away, and that resistance being absolutely part of a fundamental part of what it is to be alive and awake. And so giving in to the pull of gravity, allowing oneself to move downward, is moving against that intuition and towards or away from the feeling of being alive and awake. So I think downwards and the underness of the underworld and the underground again have those kind of correlations, are part of the phenomenology of that experience. The bit in Hillman that I think is particularly indicative of all that, actually, is in that particular paragraph, is where he mentions the lower parts of the body. I'll have to pull out the whole book and give it a proper look at, I think. But certainly that was what struck me in that particular quotation, is that the lower parts of the body are presented as just one item in a list of a number of things which represent downness and underness, the underside of stones, the darkness underneath the earth, those kind of things. But the lower part of the body, and the body generally, I think, is I guess it's kind of one of the primary organising structures, organising principles for that whole set of correspondences. It brings other correspondences of its own, of course. The lower parts of the body are associated with darkness, and they are associated with other kinds of knowledge, carnal knowledge and sexual knowledge, and scatological knowledge, which are not of the airy, clean, spatial knowledge of the top of the head where the eyes are. But I think, quite apart from that organisation of the body itself into parts, the body is a kind of axis representing up and down, and having and delivering that sense of an axis which has vertical landmarks is as I say, one of the kind of primary organising principles within that. The body embedded in a planet, embedded in experience, which makes that dimension readable and can act as an organisational template, I think.